Good afternoon. The committee will come to order. Without objection, the chair is authorized to declare a recess of the committee at any time. I now recognize myself for an opening statement. The coronavirus pandemic has put tremendous strain on America's families and caregivers. Many of us have seen firsthand in our own families, with our friends, and among our coworkers, the difficult challenges that parents, teachers, and other caregivers have faced in the last few years. During the first several months of the pandemic, families and child care providers were largely left to face these challenges alone. As a result, many were forced to drop out of the workforce or to close their businesses. Approximately 60% of child care providers closed in the spring of 2020. These closures led to over 375,000 child care workers losing their jobs. Although many of those child care providers were able to reopen, thousands of providers had closed permanently by 2021, contributing to a shortage that persists to this day. These sudden closures forced many parents to make difficult choices between keeping their jobs and caring for their children. Without the necessary support, parents with young children dropped out of the workforce in the early days of the pandemic at alarmingly high rates. Now, nearly 2 years later, men with young children have returned to the workforce at pre-pandemic rates, yet the labor participation rate of women with young children has not fully recovered. In January 2022, the most recent month for which data are available, more than 1.1 million women left the job or lost the job due to the need to care for young children. This disparity threatens to exacerbate long-standing gender-based economic inequality. Families paid high costs for children even before the pandemic. With the onset of the pandemic, child care became even less affordable to parents, with prices rising by more than 5% in 2022. At the time that child care costs for families are increasing, child care worker pay remained troublingly low. In most states, the median wage for child care workers, who are disproportionately women and minorities, was below the state's living wage. This combination of low wages and high costs is unsustainable and puts a great burden on child care providers and families while slowing our economic recovery. Congress has taken decisive action by passing 3 federal pandemic relief packages that each included funding specifically for child care. Most significantly, the American Rescue Plan included a historic $39 billion investment in child care. This investment has already had a positive impact on children providers. Early evidence indicates that these pandemic relief funds have helped child care providers stay in business and raise wages. 46% of child care providers surveyed in the summer of 2021 said the program likely would have closed without help from pandemic relief funds. Encouragingly, many recipients of relief funds also reported that their child care workers have received increased compensation. The American Rescue Plan also gave financial support directly to parents and families to offset the rising costs of child care. It temporarily expanded the child tax credit and delivered advanced monthly payments of $300 per young child from July through December 2021. American families have put these funds to good use. Census Bureau data shows that between 5 and 7 million households use child tax credit advance payments to help cover child care expenses. The American Rescue Plan also expanded the child and dependent care tax credit, providing additional assistance specifically for care. Although pandemic-related relief programs have helped families and providers cope with the immediate effects of the coronavirus, sustained federal investment is still needed to aid recovery and address problems that existed before the pandemic. The Biden-Harris administration's Build Back Better agenda includes comprehensive proposals to improve the quality and affordability of child care while delivering the compensation that child care workers and educators deserve. Continued investment in the child care sector through existing federal programs and the extension of the American Rescue Plan provisions would also support access and affordability. Extending the expanded child tax credit with its advanced monthly payment structure would continue to aid the millions of households that have used those payments for child care expenses. When we support American families and invest in the professionals who help to care for our nation's children, we are making an investment in both our present and our future. The time is now to invest in child care providers and families so that we can build a better, stronger, and more equitable economy. I would like to thank our witnesses for being here today. I look forward to hearing more about what more we can do to give families and child care providers the support that they need during the pandemic and beyond. I now recognize the ranking member for his opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Glad we had this meeting here in the committee room in person. I'd also like to thank all of our witnesses who are here with us today. Look forward to hearing their testimony. A hearing on this topic is long overdue. For more than 2 years, we've heard about the damage the U.S. COVID policies have done to our nation's children, as well as working parents. Parents pleaded with their local school boards to inject actual science and common sense in these rules. Congressional Republicans have sent letters, asked for hearings and briefings, and begged the CDC to explain the science that justified the harm that their ridiculous policies were causing to our kids. Here's what we know. Remote learning hurt children, both academically and emotionally. And scheduling disruptions at school and daycare centers created chaos for working families, hindering them from returning to the workforce at a time when we need more workers. It is clearly one of the largest U.S. failures in policy that we've seen during this pandemic. Many Democrat-led states and teachers' union bosses refused to reopen schools for more than a year in some places, despite evidence that closures and instability harm America's children. In the summer of 2020, Republicans repeatedly called on governors and school systems to fully reopen schools. Student learning loss due to remote or hybrid learning is astronomical. Millions of kids are behind in math and reading. Amplify, which is the curriculum and assessment provider, examined its test data for about 400,000 elementary school students and found that, quote, at the middle of the 2021-22 school year, in every elementary grade, K through 5, the number of students at risk of not reading is higher than it was at the same point in the 2019-20 school year. close quote. Mr. Chairman, I would like to submit 4 different studies into the record that have been done to detail the data and the detrimental impact that remote learning has had on America's children. Thank you. On top of learning loss, children and teenagers are now experiencing a mental health crisis of historic proportions. The American Academy of Pediatrics declared a national state of emergency in children's mental health, and the U.S. Surgeon General issued a youth mental health advisory. Suicide attempts by 12 to 17-year-old girls rose 51% from early 2019 to early 2021. This is having a devastating impact on our young kids. When kids have been able to go back to school or to daycare, the CDC has pushed extreme quarantine policies, especially for kids that can't wear masks. This means that if one kid in a class gets COVID, the whole class is shut down for up to 10 days. Can you imagine the negative impact this is having, not only on students, but also on their parents? Abrupt closures and long quarantines mean they miss work unexpectedly, for many days at a time. These disruptions are caused by irrational COVID policies, and they continue to this day in many cases. According to a survey by the New York Times, in January, more than half of American children missed at least 3 days of school. About 25% missed more than a week, while 14% of students missed 9 or more days. This keeps parents from returning to the workforce, and data shows that especially has had a negative impact on women. On top of that, until last Friday, the CDC said that everyone over the age of 2 had to wear a mask, even though worldwide, most countries don't mask young kids in school due to the harm that it causes those kids. And the protection masks provide to children is unknown and might be very small. The CDC said kids should be masked for the last 2 years. This is something Republicans in Congress, as well as parents across the country, have been begging the CDC to change, since we have come to learn so much more about COVID and its largely minimal impact on young kids compared to the well-documented massive damage that masks and remote learning are having on young children. Over the last few weeks, we started to see mask mandates lifted in most major cities, including New York, Chicago, and Washington, D.C., as well as Los Angeles, in restaurants and other public spaces. Yet unbelievably, the mask mandates for children in schools and daycare centers remained. Their plan was to force kids to mask all day in school or at daycare, in most cases even while they're outside. But yet adults would be allowed to be maskless in grocery stores, restaurants, bars, and of course, sporting events. I'd like to note here that this hypocrisy of some of these nonsensical political science policies have been ongoing throughout the entire pandemic. Prominent Democrats have been caught ignoring their own masking rules while forcing those same rules on children for the last 2 years. Liberal elites have been spotted without masks at hair salons, the Met Gala, professional football games, fancy restaurants, and many, many more, while those same hypocritical leaders shamed others who didn't comply with their nonsensical mandates. But as we know now, we have had this COVID miracle in the last few days. Just in time for President Biden's State of the Union address last night, we saw, just days ago, Biden's Centers for Disease Control and Prevention finally update its mask guidelines. The new guidelines mean that instead of recommending nearly the entire country mask indoors, now only 28% are recommended to do so. So overnight, more than 70% of the country, including kids in school, don't have to mask anymore. So we should ask, Mr. Chairman, what changed? Did the science change? Again, it's not the medical science. It seemed like Democrats had an epiphany of political science. And what is that new science? Here we have excerpts from a memo by a group called Impact Research, which is a well-known Democrat polling firm that also happens to be where President Biden's pollster works. So according to Punchbowl News, note the memo, by the way, is dated February 24th, 2022, just days ago. So this is what it said, quote, this is an assessment from a poll, not from medical science. 2/3 of parents and 80% of teachers say the pandemic caused learning loss and voters are overwhelmingly more worried about learning loss than kids getting COVID. 6 in 10 Americans describe themselves as worn out by the pandemic. The more we, and they're talking about Democrat-elected leaders right here, the more we talk about the threat of COVID and onerously restricting people's lives because of it, the more we turn them against us and show them we're out of touch with their daily realities. I wish that was medical science that they were basing decisions on, but it was a poll just days before the State of the Union that got them to change course. That's the kind of thing that is infuriating parents. So Biden's CDC is only loosening its masking requirements now that Democrats' polling numbers are in the tank and the midterms are around the corner. During the campaign, Joe Biden promised repeatedly to, quote, follow the science. But apparently the science changes when his polling changes. The American people see right through these masking political theater guidelines and will never forget how they played politics with our children by shuttering their schools and masking their faces, even as doctors were noting the harm that those mandates were causing to our children. People have lost faith in the CDC, and this brazen political stunt is further eroding what trust was left. Last night during the State of the Union, President Biden said, quote, let's stop looking at COVID-19 as a partisan dividing line. By the way, this is from the same president whose administration directed the Department of Justice to investigate parents who were passionately expressing their First Amendment speech rights in opposition to many of these same regulations by going to school board meetings. And what did President Biden's administration do? They tried to deem them as domestic terrorists for going to school board meetings and expressing their views. And that's after last night the president said, stop using COVID-19 as a partisan dividing line. Well, I think those parents wouldn't be so angry if President Biden paid them an apology for the things he said about them and allowed his administration to continue to call them names and try to shame them for standing up for the rights of their kids. So we're going to continue to push for medical science, not political science, and let's free up our children from this experiment that has destroyed millions of lives over these last 2 years. With that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
I thank the ranking member for his statement. I would like to say, as a parent of a school board member, it ain't expressing, it's how you express that determines whether or not you're a terrorist. I'd also like to say that I think it's because of the science of vaccinations that began to work that we had a change in the policy. But that will not fall on deaf ears. I would like now to introduce our distinguished witnesses. Gina Forbes is an early childhood educator, former administrator, and parent based in Brunswick, Maine. Ms. Forbes has a master's in education and a license in early childhood education. She brings a wealth of experience to this issue as a parent, preschool teacher, and school director. Dr. Betsy Stevenson is professor of public policy and economics at the University of Michigan. She's a labor economist who has published widely about the impact of public policies on outcomes, both in the labor market and for families. Dr. Stevenson's research focuses on women's labor market experiences and the economic forces shaping American families. Dr. Stevenson served as a member of the Council of Economic Advisors from 2013 to 2015 and served as the chief economist of the United States Department of Labor from 2010 to 2011. Dr. Leigh G.E. Alston is Executive Director of the Center for the Study of Childhood Employment, or Child Care Employment at the University of California. Dr. Alston leads the Center's research and policy agenda aimed at improving the status and well-being of early educators. She has extensive experience in the areas of workforce development, early childhood education, and public policy. Carrie L. Lucas is the president of Independent Women's Forum. She previously worked on Capitol Hill as a senior domestic policy analyst for the House Republican Policy Committee and at the Cato Institute. Dr. Lynette Fraga is the CEO of Childcare Aware and a leading voice on children policy, practice, and research. Dr. Fraga has 25 years of experience as an educator, program director, and executive leader, working on behalf of children and families. Since beginning her career in early childhood education as a teacher in infant, toddler, and preschool classrooms, Dr. Fraga has held positions at the local, state, and national levels within the nonprofit corporation and higher education sectors. Will the witnesses please rise if you're here, and those of you who may not be able to see me, raise your right hands. Do you swear or affirm that the testimony you are about to give is the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God? You may be seated. Let the record show that the witnesses answered in the affirmative. Without objection, your written statements will be made part of the record. Ms. Forbes, you are now recognized for 5 minutes for your opening statement.
Thank you. Good afternoon, Chairman Clyburn and members of the Select Subcommittee on the Coronavirus Crisis. I am honored and grateful for the opportunity to testify today. My name is Gina Forbes, and I'm here to share my experience as a parent and early childhood educator. I currently have a 13-year-old son and an almost 2-year-old daughter, and I've been working with young children and families for nearly 18 years. I will begin today by sharing my experience of being an early childhood educator and past director of a child care center, and then share my experience of navigating the challenges of childcare during the COVID-19 pandemic as a parent. From 2013 until June 2021, I worked at a program called Roots and Fruits Preschool in South Portland, Maine. I began as a teacher and was later hired as director in 2017. Roots and Fruits was nationally accredited and was of the highest quality rating. My own son attended at age 4, and I watched him thrive in the program. I was able to witness firsthand how high quality early education can set children up for lifelong success. As director, I became very intimate with the joys and challenges of running a child care program. I was first and foremost committed to quality education for the children in our care. There was always a delicate balancing act of enrolling enough children to be financially successful while keeping prices affordable to families and assuring that there were not too many children enrolled for our standard of care. It was important to our organization that we serve a diverse array of families from a variety of backgrounds, including income levels. The business structure of our organization and in the field in general was set up so that the only way to address increased costs, including increasing staff wages, was to increase tuition rates for families. Keeping the cost of care accessible to families meant keeping wages at or below a certain level for staff. This lack of fair pay, inability to offer health and other benefits, and the high demands of the job is a recipe for teacher burnout, stress, and sometimes turnover. I'm sharing this information about pre-pandemic times because it has everything to do with the crisis we found ourselves in when March 2020 came around. In the initial first wave of COVID-19, we closed our school and remained closed until mid-June, when we had clear guidelines about how to run a childcare program safely. When we finally had a reopening plan, it was at reduced enrollment, just over half of our usual functioning. To run the program, we had to raise tuition for families, and even this was not going to be enough. We projected a deficit for the year due to the loss associated with lower enrollment and the cost of additional safety materials and procedures. Thankfully, during the school year, we received a PPP loan and federal COVID relief funds that made it possible for us to run our program. These funds covered costs related to additional cleaning supplies, PPE, and helped cover the losses from our closure and lower enrollment. We were also able to give some additional bonuses to staff in lieu of hazard pay. Ultimately, these funds helped us significantly, but it was not enough to keep us open long term. With razor-thin margins and challenges present long before the pandemic, what we needed to be truly sustainable was a significant and committed long-term financial investment from state and federal funds. We could have chosen to continue to raise our tuition rates, but this would put our organization's values of offering care to diverse families at risk. It was for these reasons that I, along with our board of directors, decided to close the Roots and Fruits program, and in June 2021, I handed over the keys to the building and closed our doors permanently. As a parent, the impact of COVID-19 on the childcare sector has been felt in very challenging ways. Since Roots and Fruits closed, I've had to find a new childcare arrangement for my youngest child. We were able to find an amazing childcare provider who offers local in-home care. However, it is only part-time and it is far more expensive than we had budgeted for or can truly afford. We have inquired about other childcare possibilities that would better fit our budget. However, every program we have spoken to has a wait list and some for years to come. It is an understatement to say that it is a constant and persistent stress on me and my family to figure out how to afford high-quality childcare. One small respite from this ongoing stress was receiving the monthly child tax credit payments, which went directly toward childcare costs. Without them, I am struggling to figure out if I can continue to work or if I need to remove myself from the workforce to care for our young child. I can't help but be reminded that childcare workers are truly the workforce behind the workforce. The issues that I described today are not new, but are built into the childcare system as it has existed for many years. The pandemic has significantly exacerbated those issues. High quality early education and care is the backbone of our society, and I believe that we need to fund it accordingly. Our children, families, and educators deserve nothing less. Thank you for your time, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much, Ms. Forbes. We will now hear from Dr. Stevenson. Dr. Stevenson, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Clyburn, Ranking Member Scalise, and distinguished members of the committee. I appreciate the invitation to speak to you today. The U.S. economy and employment has evolved in a way that makes childcare now central to its functioning. While childcare is not a woman's issue, the pandemic did have a unique impact on women, and the evolution of women's role in the economy helps to explain how we've arrived at this critical juncture. While I detail the transition more in my written testimony, let me explain where we're currently at. Women are now the most educated workers in our labor force, and at the start of the pandemic, women held the majority of jobs. In our recovery from the 2008 recession, the rise in women's labor force participation drove the strong recovery, with 2/3 of the job growth going to jobs held by women. Families rely on women's earnings, and our economy relies on the skills and efforts of women. Women's personal lives have also undergone a profound shift. The result is that mothers with kids in the home as the pandemic hit were older, with more education, and more likely to be working than mothers with kids in the home during previous recessions. Stepping out of the labor force for these mothers was a less viable option, and yet for some of these mothers, it was the only option available. 2/3 of the child care centers had closed by April 2020, and the number of child care workers fell 34%. Schools around the country turned to remote learning, and many remain remote or partially remote for more than a year. The pandemic made it clear that schools and childcare both serve a dual purpose: educate and care for children. Our childcare challenges are ongoing, both because the pandemic is ongoing and because our childcare infrastructure was inadequate prior to the pandemic. While childcare disruptions have occurred across the income spectrum, they have disproportionately impacted lower wage workers and single parents, with devastating effects on their employment and earnings. Childcare related constraints led to more women than men losing jobs during the pandemic. However, childcare disruptions affected work way beyond just job loss. 59% of parents said that their employment was affected. They turned down promotions, changed employment, paused education or training, and fathers made these sacrifices even more frequently than mothers. These decisions not only mean lower incomes for families, but they mean lower potential output for the US economy. Even in good economic times, finding high quality, affordable childcare is challenging for parents. The cost of childcare, particularly high quality childcare, prior to the pandemic made working too expensive for some parents. And yet the childcare market is still far from recovering to these inadequate levels of access and affordability. Research has found that childcare is particularly sensitive to economic downturns and recovers much more slowly than the rest of the economy. Employment in childcare remains more than 10% below pre-pandemic levels, even though non-farm employment remains only 1.9% below its February 2020 level. The American Rescue Plan authorized $39 billion for childcare, much of which is just now starting to get dispersed. And while this crucial funding will serve as needed emergency support for our childcare infrastructure, it does not provide the long-term structural support childcare needs. Early childhood educators generate enormous financial benefits by engaging in developmentally appropriate curriculum-based activities that lead to higher lifetime earnings for the children in their care. And yet, childcare workers are some of the lowest paid workers in our country. Children need committed professionals to provide care and developmentally appropriate skills. But few people have the luxury of gaining training in early childhood education and committing to the profession for $12 an hour, particularly if they can make twice as much by seeking employment now at Target. The low pay is one reason that childcare has such high turnover of workers compared to other jobs in education, creating even further instability in the childcare sector. The pay of childcare providers must and will rise due to market forces. These market forces will also ultimately raise the cost of childcare, making childcare and thus labor market participation for parents even more unaffordable. The biggest economic problem the US currently faces is low labor force participation. It's likely to contribute to ongoing inflation. Solving this problem requires investing more in our youngest citizens and supporting their families with a more reliable, affordable, and higher quality childcare sector. Thank you, and I welcome your questions.
Thank you, Dr. Stevenson. We will now hear from Dr. Austin. Dr. Austin, you are recognized for 5 minutes.
Hi, thank you, Chairman Clyburn and members of the committee for the opportunity to speak with you today about the plight of childcare in America. If nothing else, the pandemic has made visible that stable quality childcare is not something that's just nice to have, it's a necessity. Yet it's severely under-resourced and a crumbling component of our nation's social infrastructure. Leading up to the pandemic, about half of families who needed childcare in the US didn't have access to it. Parents, as we've heard, mostly mothers, were losing about $37 billion in income each year because they had to reduce work hours or drop out of the workforce entirely because of childcare issues. Businesses were losing an estimated $12.7 billion a year due to childcare challenges among employees. And childcare workers were subsidizing the true cost of services with the poverty-level wages paid to them. The pandemic didn't create these circumstances, but it exacerbated them, and it brought childcare in this country to the brink of collapse. Unfortunately, it's no wonder. Care and early education, work that is performed almost exclusively by women, has long been devalued. Childcare businesses, most of which are small and women-owned, operate on very thin margins, and the slightest drop in enrollment and income was all it took for many to permanently close. By July of 2020, 1 in 5 childcare providers in California, for example, had already fallen behind on mortgage or rent payments for their business. Most childcare programs have to rely on what parents can afford to pay to fund their programs, and this renders childcare workers, as we've heard, among the lowest paid workers in every state, with an average wage of about $12 an hour. And within that, we see racial pay gaps and pay penalties, especially for those who are working with the youngest children, our infants and toddlers. For programs that have managed to stay open, they're having trouble staffing up, as they simply can't compete with businesses like retail and food service, which are now paying starting wages of $15 or more and also offering benefits. It's not hyperbole to say that conditions are dire for the childcare workforce. 98% of other occupations in this country are paid more than childcare workers. Poverty rates are double those of other workers in general, and on average, 8 times higher than that of K-8 teachers. In another study, we found that a third of childcare workers we surveyed were food insecure, and fewer than 15% would be able to withstand a $400 emergency. These findings aren't unique to California. Researchers have identified similar financial stressors in states, for example, like Nebraska, Louisiana, and Oregon. To bring attention to their persistently low wages, for decades, childcare workers have posed this riddle. Why did the childcare worker cross the road to get to her second job? It wasn't meant to be funny then, and it's certainly no joke today. My colleague, Dr. Caitlin McLean, met Shania Bell, a childcare worker who literally crossed the street for a better paying job at a hardware store. Every day, walking past the job and the children she loved and that she was really good at for a job that allowed her to actually pay her bills. A similar scenario is playing out all across the country, as evidenced by the program closures and the childcare jobs shortages. We've lost to date 131,000 childcare jobs since February 2020. The federal pandemic relief programs have provided important stopgap measures. Many states jumped at the opportunity to invest in their workforce. We know of at least 28 that are specifically using federal relief funds to intentionally support wages and the recruitment and retention of early educators. Critically, relief has helped many hold on, but it cannot, nor was it designed to provide long-term fixes. Our economy relies on workers who are parents, and so many parents cannot work without reliable childcare, and childcare cannot work effectively until its own workforce is secure. Dependable long-term investments that decouple what parents can afford from what workers are paid is the key to ensuring that childcare programs are able to stay open and to recruit and retain staff who can meet America's childcare needs. I appreciate the opportunity to appear before the committee, and I look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Austin. We will now hear from Ms. Lucas. Ms. Lucas, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Oops, sorry. Good afternoon. I'm Carrie Lucas, president of Independent Women's Forum. Independent Women's Forum is a nonprofit organization dedicated to developing and advancing policies that aren't just well-intended, but that actually enhance people's freedom, opportunity, and well-being. I'm also mother to 5 kids between the ages of 7 and 16. I'm going to quickly run through what I think of as 5 key lessons we learned during COVID-19 about childcare and supporting families and caregivers. First and most importantly, we should reject any public policy changes that would make our childcare and preschool systems function more like our K-12 public schools. Like many working parents during COVID-19, I had to juggle my job along with managing my kids' schooling online. Where I live, most private schools provided in-person learning service by fall 2020, but our public schools fought to stay closed for another 7 months. That was long after it made any sense from a COVID or health perspective, long after our teachers had been given priority access to vaccines, and long after it was obvious that it was an utter catastrophe in terms of emotional health and lost learning for students, particularly for children from low-income families, those with disabilities, and those for whom English is a second language. The failures of our K-12 schools contrast with the child care sector. At the height of the pandemic, according to HHS, about 60% of child care centers closed. The rest stayed open to serve children of critical workers. By the end of 2020, however, an estimated 73% of daycare, preschool, and child care programs had reopened. In contrast, at the end of 2020, only about a third of K-12 public schools were providing fully in-person services. Public schools behave this way because they do not see parents and students as their customers. And why would they? Their ability to pay the bills and keep their jobs depends on pleasing government officials, not on serving families. Parents should fight to keep this from becoming the same situation for childcare and preschools. The second big takeaway is that policymakers at all levels of government should seek to eliminate regulations that aren't directly related to safety and quality so that a greater diversity of providers, especially smaller and at-home providers, enter the marketplace so that parents have more and better options. COVID, as the other witnesses have attested to, COVID has forced many daycare providers out of business. But as we all know, sadly, this was a bad trend that was already ongoing. The number of at-home daycare providers fell by half between 2005 and 2017. A review of state-based childcare regulations reveals ludicrous examples of rules that dictate the minutia of care, the number of art supplies you have to have, the exact size of balls per children. This clearly isn't necessary for kids and just creates headaches and drives up costs for providers. Third, policymakers should consider tax relief for those who have very young children, since they often do face large expenses. However, policymakers should not make that financial support conditional on childcare arrangements. Incentivizing the use of paid childcare isn't fair to all the families with loved ones, parents, grandparents, aunts, uncles, who provide loving care for children in their lives for free while forgoing paid employment. Fourthly, government funding for childcare is often sold as a surefire way to improve life outcomes for children. However, the evidence simply doesn't bear this out. A recent study in Tennessee of their state-run pre-K program revealed it had long-term negative effects on children's achievements and behavior. Now, that doesn't mean that no study will ever find benefits associated with preschool, nor does it mean that daycare and childcare isn't a vital and a service for millions of children and families. But it should encourage some more humility and caution among policymakers and warn us away from trying to push all children into government-approved childcare centers, since that could do more harm than good. Finally, the recent proposed Build Back Better plan would have made the federal government the biggest player in daycare and preschool programs, and this approach is incredibly dangerous and should be rejected. Put aside the enormous cost to taxpayers and potentially for millions of families. These government regulations will discourage innovation and create a less diverse childcare sector. In fact, all of the battles that we see raging about public K-12 schools over the content of curriculum, the use of pronouns, sex ed, masking policies, they will be coming to your local daycare and preschool if government becomes the primary funder and sets the rules for what constitutes an approved daycare provider. We see some of this happening already with Head Start. Right now, everyone's unmasking, but not the poor 2- and 3-year-olds that are on our Head Start programs, and that seems a tragedy. 2-year-olds shouldn't be political footballs for federal officials, and we need to keep the federal government as far away as possible from deciding what happens in daycare and preschool. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Lucas. Finally, we'll hear from Dr. Fraga. Dr. Fraga, you're recognized for 5 minutes. Now we're pronouncing that name correctly.
Fraga is correct. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Chairman Clyburn, Ranking Member Scalise, members of the Select Subcommittee on the Coronavirus Crisis. Thank you for inviting me to testify here today. Without question, the pandemic highlighted the growing lack of access to affordable, quality childcare in the United States. To be clear, childcare was already in crisis before the pandemic. The pandemic only made it worse. This long-standing, exacerbated state of childcare crisis has negatively impacted child development and family economic security for too long. Childcare Aware of America is the leading voice on childcare. And as CEO, I have the good fortune of working with a network of childcare resource and referral agencies, childcare programs and educators, and families across the country. We lead projects that increase the quality and availability of childcare, conduct research, and advocate for policies that positively impact the lives of children and families. Simply put, our work places us at the nexus of nearly every challenge and stressor facing our nation's childcare system today. Last month, CCAOA released Demanding Change, Repairing Our Childcare System, which outlines how the U.S. childcare system has changed since the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic. We found that between December 2019 and March 2021, nearly 16,000 childcare programs across 37 states have permanently closed, representing a 9% decline in the total number of licensed childcare providers, both center and home-based. At the same time, childcare continues to be unaffordable and inaccessible for too many families. In 2020, the national annual average price of childcare was between $9,800 and $10,200 if you take the annual average price of all settings and types of care. In many states, the annual price of center-based childcare for an infant exceeds the annual cost of in-state tuition at a public four-year university. Additionally, almost half of parents with children under age 6 searching for care in the past 2 years said the greatest barriers to access were cost, lack of available spaces, and location. This is partly due to the specific impacts of the pandemic. Childcare providers are experiencing higher operating costs, challenges retaining their workforce, and lower or fluctuating attendance, which directly impacts their financial viability. Even before the pandemic, the supply of childcare was decreasing, and the price of childcare was out of reach for parents. Insufficient public investment in childcare has left families and childcare providers to bear the financial burden of supporting an unsustainably under-resourced system. Thankfully, Congress stepped in to help the childcare system cope with immediate pandemic-driven issues with 3 relief packages. States have leveraged these flexible funds to meet their unique needs, and no 2 states are spending dollars in the same way. Relief funds have helped thousands of childcare programs remain open during the pandemic, given more families access to high-quality care in a variety of settings so they could return to work, and have helped many early childhood educators to be more fairly compensated. Simply put, COVID relief funds have been a lifeline for many child care programs. The March 2021 American Rescue Plan included $39 billion dedicated for child care relief, and those funds were divided up into 2 pots, $24 billion for stabilization grants and $15 billion in discretionary funding. While state disbursement of funds was initially slow, states have made progress. As of February 2022, 47 states and the District of Columbia launched their stabilization grant applications. Good examples have emerged of how states, many in partnership with intermediaries like child care resource and referral agencies, are ensuring the stabilization grant process is equitable, efficient, and transparent. States have also made progress spending their discretionary funds. The most common policies nationwide have included increasing subsidy eligibility and eliminating copays for families, increasing compensation and benefits for educators, and improving provider payment policies. This is welcome news given the pandemic has added to the challenges of workforce recruitment and retention, with workers leaving the field temporarily or permanently to find higher paid work and benefits during a time of health and economic uncertainty. We are already seeing the impact of these relief funds. In Maryland, 90% of the 5,757 applications for funding received grants. In New York, 14,866 funding requests have been approved, with over 10,000 payments fully dispersed. Despite relief funds, the childcare industry is still facing serious challenges. The positive changes secured by the short-term addition of relief funding make a strong argument for why longer-term investments are needed. All the stories you have heard and will hear today are connected to why we need a system of childcare that honors its workforce, supports its families, and truly cares for its children. Thank you again for the opportunity to appear before the subcommittee today. I look forward to answering your questions.
Thank you very much, Dr. Fraga. And with the ranking member's agreement, I'm going to yield first to Ms. Waters for 5 minutes of questions.
Thank you so very much. I heard what you said, questions, but I want to thank you for your patience and your tolerance. I want to thank you because when I first heard Mrs. Scalise start to talk about this issue, I thought, oh my God, we're going to have bipartisan support for child care. And then he went into this political argument about math. So I thank you for your tolerance. Let me get to the question. The pandemic hit many of our essential workers very hard, and child care providers were among those who felt the brunt of the pandemic's impact. More than 370,000 child care workers lost their jobs, and thousands of child care centers closed. And so, this is a graphic that shows the pandemic caused dramatic decline in child care capacity. It's dramatic. Absolutely. So, Dr. Austin, your center has published reports showing the impact of the pandemic on child care workers and early educators. who are overwhelmingly women and disproportionately women of color. Like many essential workers and small business owners, they faced incredible economic challenges during the pandemic. Dr. Austin, what financial difficulties did the pandemic bring for child care workers and early educators?
Thank you for your question. The pandemic really just pulled the rug out from under our child care workforce. Again, these are folks who are earning $12 an hour. As the country closed in the early stages of the pandemic, child care workers continued to show up, and they continued to show up without resources for quite some time until we finally got some relief packages. So we saw that programs were falling behind on their mortgages. For our home-based providers, the mortgage is their house. That's where they live. And so they were taking on debt, people were working without paying themselves, and falling further and further behind. And we see high rates of economic insecurity being reported, people are food insecure, and the result is we see that people are walking away. They have been demoralized by the treatment that they received, that they did stay open. Very few states initially in that first year offered hazard pay for child care workers. And so folks are walking away. They're saying, we've had enough, and we're going to go get those jobs at Target and Starbucks where they're paying $15, $17 an hour and able to offer them benefits. So it really undermined folks in their own lives.
Well, thank you so very much. Is that Dr. Fraga or Fraga? Fraga. You talked about this being a problem prior to the pandemic. And I reflected on my early years as a young mother with 2 children and desperate for child care. And the best I could do was get the lady who lived in the back of me, who was half ill herself and aged, to try and watch my children while I worked. And so many of us have been struggling for years when we were young mothers, before our careers were absolutely, realized. That we needed something better, we needed more. And of course, I come from the Head Start program, having worked in Head Start while I could not get child care for my children. And so tell us how bad it is. I know you alluded to this, but would you again reiterate for Mr. Scalise in particular about how bad it is?
Yes, thank you for your question, Representative Waters. It is a challenge and a trauma and a tragedy, frankly, for so many of our early care and education providers and for our families. This is creating a tremendous amount of stress. Prior to the pandemic, we were already seeing a decrease in the early childhood workforce. Subsequent to the pandemic, we're seeing hundreds of thousands of jobs being lost by the early care and education workforce, and the stress that's created that Dr. Austin named, housing insecurity, financial insecurity, et cetera, that these small business owner women, and often minority-owned women business owners, really experiencing a great deal of stress, not only for families who are unable to access care, but also for those early care and education providers who are also under a great deal of stress. And remember, these are the individuals who are in classrooms and in early learning programs with our nation's children. So incredibly important for us to continue to move forward in supporting our children.
Thank you so very much. I hope Mrs. Scalise heard you.
Would the gentlelady yield? I'd be happy to.
Gentlelady has no time.
That's clear. I'll answer your question on my time. Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. To follow up where the gentlelady from California left off, she was, I guess, criticizing the politics, and frankly, I would share with her that same criticism. The problem is that I was quoting President Biden's polling firm. There was no science that the CDC fell on to change the guidance. It was the polling firm from President Biden that said literally days before CDC changed the guidance, quote, 2/3 of parents and 80% of teachers say the pandemic caused learning loss, and voters are overwhelmingly more worried about the learning loss. They went on to say, the more we talk, we being the Democrats, the more we talk about the threat of COVID and onerously restrict people's lives because of it, the more we turn them against us and show them we're out of touch with their daily realities. Then they went on to say, and if Democrats continue to hold a posture that prioritizes COVID precautions over learning how to live in a world where COVID exists but does not dominate, they risk paying dearly for it in November. So President Biden's polling firm just days ago released this memo warning Democrats that their radical positions on COVID are hurting their chances of winning in November, and then the CDC turned around and changed their rules. Now, we've been urging them to change the rules for a long time because their rules were wrong, but they wouldn't do it because it was hurting kids. They did it because their pollster told them it was going to hurt their chances of getting elected in November. And so
Would the gentleman yield for a question?
That's just science. That's the political science that President Biden's polling firm laid out. I'd be happy to yield.
Are you presenting evidence that that affected their decision rather than the simple fact that the amount of virus circulation has been dropping like a rock, and when the virus in circulation drops to a low enough level, you no longer need masks?
Well, reclaiming my time, we've seen the circulation drop in previous months, and yet they didn't change the guidance from CDC for that. You know what we do know? And again, there's a history within the White House of manipulating the science and their decisions based on influencing. Here it's polling influence. We saw the teachers union influence their recommendation on schools in the past. That's well documented, by the way. We've talked about that in this committee before. So the Biden administration has a history, despite Joe Biden as a candidate saying, we're going to follow the science. He's manipulated the science in the past to bow to union bosses. Now he's manipulating the science to bow to his own horrible polling. But these are, I'll be happy, by the way, to submit this for the record, Mr. Chairman. This was a memo, February 24, 2022, from President Biden's polling firm where they made these recommendations that this is based upon. Now I'd like to get to some questions. Ms. Lucas, I appreciated your recommendation. Ms. Waters, I'm glad we got to clear that up. Ms. Lucas, your recommendations I very much appreciate. I want to talk about the damage we've seen to kids. We've had many hearings in this committee where we talked about the damage that kids are experiencing in the classroom from not learning properly if they're not in the classroom, but also even the masking guidelines, what it's doing to the psyche of our young children, suicides through the roof. Again, looking at the data, suicide attempts by 12 to 17-year-old girls rose 51% from early 2019 to 2021. Can you explain how the CDC's flawed guidance has actually contributed to the mental health crisis that we see our young kids facing?
Well, certainly. I mean, we've seen, and it's interesting because we do have a different localities have made different decisions when it comes to how to handle schools. So there have been some schools that have been open and providing in-person learning, and you can see the differences where schools have been closed the longest. There's been the greatest learning losses, and then these increase in mental health and other issues, including rising obesity from kids being prevented from playing sports, that all of these are contributing to our problems when we come to school closures. With masking, the thing that it'll be interesting, because this is a tremendous experiment that we've been conducted on young children. We knew that young children were not very vulnerable to COVID, and that COVID was, mercifully gentle with kids, and the kids' risks are low. We don't yet know all of the damage that we've done in terms of kids' speech development. We know that speech development there are evidence that there have been declines, but the mental health impact we'll be discovering for years to come just how damaging this has been to this next generation.
Well, thanks, and we know that from other studies that kids who don't learn proficiently, especially in reading and some of the basic skills, if they don't read, for example, by the third grade, that they're more likely to leave school without a diploma than proficient readers. So if you look at these disparities, where again, some school systems followed the science and stayed open, some bowed to the unions and closed, do we know what kind of damage this is going to cause to our kids long term?
Yes, I mean, McKinsey and Company just came out with a study that showed that there's an estimated net learning loss because of the learning gaps that have been created by school closures of about $50,000 of lost potential income in the future. And this isn't evenly distributed. Obviously, the places where the in-person learning was denied for the longest, which tend to be overwhelmingly lower income minority communities, that they were disproportionately affected and will have the longest harm long term.
Well, thanks. And Mr. Chairman, we'll try to get that study and see if we can get that included in the record later. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. The chair now recognizes himself for 5 minutes. Dr. Fragas, I want to talk to you a little bit, or ask you questions about the $39 billion of support for child care recovery, including the $24 billion for stabilization grant providers. I want to know how important you think these stabilization grants are.
Thank you for the question, Chairman Clyburn. Well, every state has actually approached the stabilization grants differently. There have been a number of trends that we have seen across the country that support equity, efficiency, and transparency in distribution of those stabilization grants. What is, to be clear, these grants have been incredibly helpful for states. For example, in the realm of equity, populations like infants and toddlers and those who are open, those programs who are open during non-traditional hours. In some states, there are additional tiers of support for those programs. And efficiency, we're seeing distribution of funding being through direct deposits, for example, though they are available for checks, simple opt-out processes in some states. So the ability for there to be some level of efficiency and also transparency, which is incredibly important. We're a wealth of information on who has applied for and been approved for the ability to be able to receive grants. So these are all ways that these stabilization grants have been able to be helpful for programs and for providers, and for families, so that they can be able to access programs. And we've really seen a tremendous amount of effort. We're now at almost all states who have at least applications up online so that folks can access. And we're seeing the thousands of these grants being distributed to providers who really need it in real time.
Well, thank you for that. I want to go back. The ranking member talked about the child needing to be reading by the 3rd grade, or what the catastrophic consequences are. As a former public school teacher, I want to ask you, are you familiar, or are you keeping up with how this $15 billion is being spent, and what kind of programs are coming forward? Because I'm particularly interested in the fact that we keep talking about grade school. We aren't talking about those child care centers that got closed when kids were 3, 4, and 5 years old. And what would happen then when they finally get to school? Because the child care centers were closed.
Yes.
These kids weren't getting anything. No preparation, no Head Start, no nothing, if I might use that double negative. Could you tell us about that $15 billion?
Of course, yes. So I think one of the initial and sort of most important things that we need to emphasize is that it's so critically important for child care programs to be affordable, accessible, and of quality. And that's really where a lot of our intention and what we're seeing happening in states is to ensure that accessibility comes by way of families lowering the eligibility for programs, ensuring that for programs that they're getting the supports they need in order to stay open, the grant funding that they need so that they can stay open. We need to ensure that as we're thinking about, and what we're seeing in the trend data right now, is that there are real intentional dollars being going to the fact that, again, to your point, some of these programs have closed, either temporarily or leading to permanent closure. What that impacts are the inability for parents to be able to access quality childcare, for these families to be able to return to work, for children to be able to be nurtured and safe in quality settings. That's where these dollars are going in order to support the whole system of care, which is incredibly important for our children and for our families. We talk about issues related to mental health and stress. Those are not only experiences of children in the classrooms or early childhood programs, but this is impacting parents who can't get to work, can't get food on the table, can't be able to pay the bills, and this is affecting children and their stress levels as well. So it is going to take a whole system approach in order to really make a difference. We need to look at robust long-term public investments to make these kinds of things a reality.
Well, thank you very much for that. I could get deeper into this, but I don't want Mr. Jordan to get too nervous. So the chair now recognizes Mr. Jordan for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. On September 29th of last year, the National School Board Association sent a letter to the Biden administration asking them to implement the Use the Patriot Act against moms and dads showing up at school board meetings. 5 days later, the Attorney General of the United States sends a memorandum to the director at the FBI doing exactly what the School Boards Association asked the Biden administration to do. Namely, he says in the memorandum, I'm directing the FBI to working with the United States Attorney to convene meetings and to, quote, set up an open, dedicated line of communication for threat reporting, to set up a snitch line on parents. 2 weeks later, on October 20th, because of a whistleblower, we find out that the FBI then sent an email to agents around the country where they say apply a threat tag to parents, put this label, this designation on parents. Here's what the whistleblower told us. He said, I believe this email is evidence that the FBI is proceeding to collect information on parents who protest at school board meetings. All that happens in 22 days. First question I would ask is, I have never seen the federal government move that fast on anything. But all that happens on 22 days, which made me wonder about it because we learned that it actually didn't start with the school board's letter. We know that the Department of Education and the Biden administration went to the school board. So it didn't come from the school board to the government. The government went to the school board and said, give us the pretext to do what we want to do, namely go after moms and dads. In his opening statement, Ms. Lucas, the chairman of this committee said, we need to give parents, it's a quote, give parents the support they need. I think what the federal government needs to do is quit treating parents as domestic terrorists. Maybe we should start there. So I think in your opening comments, Ms. Lucas, you said you had 5 children, is that right?
Yes.
And your kids go to school, right?
Public school here in
All public school right here,
Public school,
right
Fairfax County.
Right across the river in Fairfax County, Virginia. You ever show up at school board meetings?
I have.
You been to a few of them?
Just one.
Did you speak out at it?
I certainly did.
Do you think there's a threat tag associated with your name now at the FBI?
I don't know. You guys would have to tell me who's listening, but it's possible. It certainly is a concern. I know that that type of concern discourages a lot of parents from speaking out for just those reasons.
Yeah, I think it's all designed. I think that's the goal. I think it's to try to intimidate parents from speaking out on COVID policies, on CRT, or frankly anything they care about speaking out on about their kids' education. I think it's an effort to intimidate and chill First Amendment free speech. Would you agree with that?
Very much.
Yeah, let's go to, and what did you speak out? I'm just curious, and when you spoke out at your school board meeting, what did you speak out about? About
the masking policy. This was after Governor Youngkin had provided the executive order to give parents the right to unmask, and my kids were denied that right and suspended when I tried to exercise that right, and so I went to tell the school board that I thought it was an inappropriate and abusive policy.
What kind of response did you get from the school board?
Nothing. They yawned and kept the school mask policy on, and it took another act of law and some brave, finally bipartisan pushback from parents demanding that our kids be unmasked, since everybody else in Virginia essentially had been unmasked for a long time, and there was tremendous concern about the harm it was doing to kids.
It seems to me that the science has been pretty clear on this with kids for a long time, as the ranking member, Mr. Scalise, pointed out earlier. Why do you think they continue to do it then?
You know, I do think that it became a bit of a political symbol, and because, mostly I think because they think they can. I do think that public school parents are a captive audience. It's very expensive to leave and enroll in a private school, and so they didn't have to. And I would just add quickly that, you know, I think that as we talk about the problems with childcare and the decline in services that happened during COVID-19, I think we should kind of imagine the counterfactual that if our childcare centers had been run like our public K-12 schools, as if a Build Back Better plan had been in place where the government was the primary funder of schools, just how more pronounced the problems would have been, because all of those schools would have had the same incentives as our public schools did and would have denied in-person service for as long as humanly possible, as they certainly did in Virginia.
Yeah. I'm just amazed at everything they told us that was wrong. I mean, I remember Joe Biden telling us when he ran for the job that he had a plan. I mean, that's obvious he did, and he told us that he would never impose a vaccine mandate. He did, so much so that the Supreme Court had to say it was unconstitutional. They told us this virus didn't come from a lab, it wasn't gain of function, and it didn't involve our tax dollars. All three of those things look like they were false. They told us the vaccinated couldn't get it. They told us the vaccinated couldn't transmit it. They told us that there was no such thing as natural immunity. So there's 8 lies, 8 pieces of misinformation they told us, and then forever they told moms who know a little bit more about their kids than the government does, they told them, you have to put a mask on your kid. I mean, it's just crazy. So we got a little discussion earlier about the politics. It's been totally about the politics, and anyone with common sense can see that. And I just want to read one last time well, I guess I won't read it because we're cutting them off, even though everyone else got to go over time. Mr. Chairman, I yield back. I yield back.
Well, if you want to yield to me for a question, I'm glad to let you go over, because I would like to know whether or not free speech at a school board meeting allows one to say to a school board member, I know your address. I just want you to know I know your address. Is that a way to address school board policy?
No,
just asking.
No, what I'm asking is when moms and dads' names get a designation or a label associated with their name that the FBI keeps, I think that has, call me crazy, but I think that has the potential to chill speech. And I would argue that's exactly what they were trying to do, as evidenced by the fact it was Secretary Cardenas who went to the School Boards Association and asked them to send the letter that prompted this whole thing, that within 22 days got the FBI to send an email out that a whistleblower gave to us, thank goodness for this whistleblower, where this whistleblower said, this is not how it's supposed to operate. That's what I know. And now we've seen the impact it's had on parents across the country. That's my point. It's been about politics. Again, I would just read what Mr.
Every
Police
terrorist
read.
in the country that's ever been arrested, I think, had children. With that, the chair yields
Well, I
to
appreciate
Ms. Maloney.
that profound wisdom.
5 minutes. Ms. Maloney.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The pandemic has made clear that affordable quality childcare plays an essential role in promoting gender equity and economic opportunity. Ms. Forbes, I understand that you're a parent of a young child as well as an early childhood educator. You have dealt with the trade-offs between furthering your career and obtaining quality childcare for your child. Can you discuss how the lack of affordable, available childcare has impacted your ability to work and develop your own career?
Absolutely. Thank you for your question, Congresswoman. It's been an ongoing challenge since I even had my older son in 2008, where just the question of how can I work for wages that are not much higher or perhaps the same as what I would pay out for the cost of childcare. And it's just a no-win situation. So particularly now raising a young child in the pandemic with the additional stresses of that, it's just been an untenable situation of every day figuring out, can I go to work tomorrow? Can I go to work next week? Can I continue to teach in a field that needs me desperately? We need every educator to show up to work and be there for other families. Yet I don't know if I'm going to be able to pay my care provider this week or next week. And so, as I mentioned in my opening statements, the expanded child tax credit was very helpful for me. It came in and it went right back out the door to pay for child care costs. And without that, it's just an everyday struggle to know what to do next.
Well, thank you. I think many parents have had the same experience as you, including myself. A Federal Reserve analysis showed that the onset of the pandemic caused many parents of young children to drop out of the labor force, with longer lasting effects for mothers than for fathers. Mothers of young children in particular saw a larger drop in labor force participation than women without children. Professor Stevenson, could these pandemic impacts on childcare availability have long-term ramifications for women's careers and gender equity in the workforce?
They absolutely can. And one of the things I highlighted in my testimony is we even need to look beyond the people who dropped out of work, because some people hung on to some kind of work, but different work than they would be doing if they had access to better childcare. That kind of reallocation that is continuing to go on and explains why we see a shortage of workers today, why we see what people are calling the Great Resignation or the Great Reallocation, because people are trying to figure out what's the spot for them in an economy in which they've had to make sacrifices due to childcare. And with so few childcare spots available right now at such a high cost, I think it's going to be a long time for women and parents to get back. And I do just want to emphasize that, I do think we need to realize this is impacting men's careers as well. It pains me to say it, that maybe people will pay more attention when I tell you that the fathers are getting hammered here too, but the fathers are getting hammered. And overall, the U.S. economy really depends on parents having stable, reliable childcare for both mothers and fathers' sake.
Thank you. The American Rescue Plan that President Biden signed into law last year is already helping to address this crisis. My home state of New York used the American Rescue Plan funds to support a $2.3 billion investment in child care early last year. Dr. Austin, your center published an analysis showing that New York City is one of the only areas where child care employment was regained in pre-pandemic level. How is the American Rescue Plan supporting New York's child care recovery, and what lessons can be learned from New York's progress?
Thank you for your question. New York City is very interesting. So when we look at New York returning to pre-pandemic levels, I think there's a couple things that have happened there. The combination of relief funds getting into the community, and another really important point about New York City is that New York City has a larger share of publicly contracted child care programs than we see in many places around the country. Our research has found that publicly contracted programs, so like state preschool programs and Head Start programs, which temporarily closed and then did reopen as most childcare reopened, were more stable, that they were able to withstand the pandemic better, keep their programs open, pay the bills, and continue to pay their staff. So I think that's part of what's going on in New York City. And New York State as a whole is also beginning to see more recovery, again, with those relief dollars, providing important relief to keep people working in those programs. Just the last thing I want to say there is I think one thing that's important to remember as we see this return to pre-pandemic employment, which is important, it doesn't signal that the communities have totally recovered, because of course we had incredible shortages of childcare before the pandemic hit, but this does show that the pandemic relief dollars and public contracts are helping programs move forward.
Well, we definitely have to do more. My time has expired. I thank the panelists for investing in our child care system. I yield back. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much, Ms. Maloney. As we go to Ms. Miller-Meek for questions, I'm going to hand the chair to Dr. Foster so I can go vote.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. I recently heard in this room, and I've heard this before, about the pandemic being politicized. And if the left didn't politicize the pandemic, can someone help explain to me the science of Democrat governors lifting mask mandates for adults, but not for children in schools, or them posing with children in schools completely masked, even though they have low levels of transmission, almost infinitesimally low levels of illness or death, but yet the lawmaker being unmasked? I didn't think so, because there is no science that would support masking children with adults unmasked. Having said that, I'd like to thank our witnesses for coming before us and sharing their testimony today. Mothers disproportionately shouldered the responsibility for children during remote or hybrid schooling and daycare disruptions. Many are unable to return to the workplace because at any given moment, their child's class, school, or child care facility could be shut down over a single positive COVID test with no illness. In January of 2022, the male labor force participation rate was up to 70%, while the female rate was just at 58%. This is likely related to the fact in early January of 2022 that there were nearly 7,500 school closures due to the Omicron surge, even though we knew that there was little risk of illness. Ms. Lucas, how has the instability in school and daycare systems contributed to women's exodus and continued absence from the workforce? And how can we get women who choose to work back to work?
Yeah, you know, it's interesting because there has been a drop-off in both men and women's labor force participation and with those and with children, but it's actually the labor force drop-off has been larger among children, among parents of kids, school-age kids, not in this child care in the 0 through 5, which really is the focus of this hearing. Which we do need to make sure we absolutely need to make it easier for more child care centers to open, so that people do have those options. Make child care, reduce regulations, and the kind of forced closures and the really expensive, disruptive policies that have made running a daycare center so difficult. But again, I think that when we look at the real problems with labor force participation, a lot of it is driven not by the lack of childcare. It's about the total independability of our public school system, particularly in Democratic states where the schools remained closed for more than a year.
According to emails obtained by the Americans for Public Trust, the American Federation of Teachers was provided a pre-release copy of the CDC's updated school guidelines in February of 2021. The pre-release version of the guidance, written prior to the influence of the AFT, stated that schools could provide in-person education regardless of the community transmission. And in fact, in Iowa, Governor Reynolds opened schools to in-person learning in the fall of 2020 without significant consequence of illness or transmission or super spreader events. Unfortunately, the CDC bowed to the pressure of the AFT, forcing thousands of schools to remain virtual. In fact, the AFT's exact suggested language appeared in the CDC's final guidance. Ms. Lucas, do you think it's fair that the teachers' union had the ability to edit the guidance?
No, it's absolutely appalling, and I do think it's a really it's a clarifying moment in us seeing one of the problems with how children have been treated as pawns during this pandemic, and really opened our eyes to the problems that are inherent in our public school system, which did not prioritize children, did not prioritize families during this pandemic, and why we need to change. We should not move in the direction of moving towards a public-funded and government-controlled daycare system. Instead, we should be thinking about how to liberalize and how to give parents more leverage over our public school system so they would be more responsive, care more about children's mental health and development, and not really and not sacrifice them as they did during COVID.
That is so well said. Democrats, unfortunately, chose the teachers' union over teachers who wanted to return to school, parents, and most importantly, children. Now we are seeing the effects of their harmful choices. America's children are broken. Do you agree? And shouldn't the CDC base its guidance off science?
Absolutely, and I do think it's interesting. We'll be learning about this in years. We'll be having conversations about the lasting damage that's been done due to school closures, the increased mental health problems for not just for little kids who are forced to mask and are still masking today in Head Start programs and in many daycare centers, but that have affected preteens, vulnerable. I know among my kids, I feel the worst for my middle-aged children. It's such a hard age, and I think this has made it just incredibly worse. So we'll be seeing this for years to come, sadly.
Yeah, and the spiraling level of youth suicides. Thank you so much. Mr. Chair, I yield back my time.
Thank you. And at this point, I will yield to myself for 5 minutes of questioning. When you see our society coming under stress, our labor market coming under stress, one of the places that I look for lessons are the greatest generation, because we've been here before. There was a tremendous labor force shortfall during World War II. And one of the most fundamental and successful ways of plugging that labor force shortage was Rosie the Riveter. But Rosie the Riveter needed daycare. And so in response to that, the federal government stepped up. They passed something called the Lanham Act, which was the federal government just setting up a bunch of federally funded daycare centers. And as a result of that natural experiment, we learned a lot about the long-term benefits of providing kids daycare. And so Ms. Stevenson, could you say a little bit about this program and what the lessons learned have been?
Yes, as you noted, it was popularly known as the Lanham Act. It was also called the Defense Housing and Community Facilities and Services Act of 1940 because it was attached to the defense industry. We were at war and we needed to try to figure out how to get women into factories. And so the issue was, well, their kids are going to need childcare. So all families, regardless of income, were eligible for what was really high quality childcare at a very, very low cost. A ton of research has been done into what did that do for the kids? What did that do for the families? And early research showed that the child care strengthened family bonds, that the children enjoyed the child care, and that the primary goal, increasing mothers' employment, was achieved, and that children's long-term outcomes were improved. We saw that these children went on to have higher high school graduation rates, higher education rates in general, and went on to earn more money as an adult. So to give you a little bit of math behind it, $100 in Lanham Act funding increased high school graduation rates by 1.8 percentage points. That is a super cheap way to increase high school graduation by 1.8 percentage points. College graduation rates by 1.9 percentage points, and employment for these kids when they grew up and were in their late 40s and early 50s by 0.7 percentage points. So, and increased earnings by 1.8%. So these are big, big effects. And I think that they speak to the broader point, which is we know high quality early childhood education can have huge effects on people's earnings as adults. And so the idea of investing more in childcare, it's not just about parents and getting parents into the workforce. The Lanham Act did that. It got the moms into the workforce, but it did something even more important. And that's what I think childcare is really about, which is it got those kids to earn more as adults. I'm gonna end with just giving you one last fact, which is a study that was done just around a decade or so ago, found that a high quality kindergarten teacher can generate $320,000 in value by increasing the earnings of the kids that are in her classroom. You know, I don't know the estimates for a high quality preschool or early childhood educator, but it's reasonable to say that it would probably be around $100,000 or more. So there's a lot that these educators do, and yet, you know, we simply don't have the fundings to pay people appropriately and to give all kids access.
All right, and so the big increase in lifetime earnings will presumably also be associated with a big increase in the amount of tax revenue collected from these people. So is it actually the case, well, you don't have to do the math to see that it is clearly the case, that the federal taxpayer won with this investment, that it paid off, and it actually allowed us to lower tax rates over time because we made this early investment and won from that investment? Is there any way around that conclusion, or is it clearly true?
That is clearly true. And when we look at high quality early childhood education, what we see is about $1 in spending returns $9 to the taxpayer down the line. You got to wait for it because when you're investing in a 2-year-old, you might not get it all the way back till they're in their 50s. So it's a long wait, but these are net present value numbers. So that means that I'm adjusting for that long wait and still telling you that the taxpayers get it back in the long run. You know, the research on parents is parents even know this, and the parents would make these investments themselves if they could afford to. And, you know, in fact, that's why very high income parents do make these investments. And it is other parents who just are unable to make the choice, unable to afford making those high quality investments in their kids, but the taxpayers can do it and they would get the money back.
Thank you, and my time has expired. It's one of the large number of things that the greatest generation got right and we haven't relearned yet. And at this point, I'll recognize Representative Raskin for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I heard the ranking member announce the apparently breathtaking discovery that politicians take polls, and some even pay attention to what the majority believes. I would remind him of a president who responded neither to the science nor to the polls, and that's the president whose lethal recklessness in public health and whose sickening pro-Putin policies for 4 years, they did everything they could to obscure and explain away. Donald Trump's own COVID-19 advisor, Deborah Birx, has said that we lost unnecessarily hundreds of thousands of people because of the failures of Donald Trump, who never developed a plan to combat and defeat COVID-19, but rather trivialized it, denied it, waved it away, hawked fake miracle cures like hydroxychloroquine and injecting yourself with bleach, and did everything he could to prevent us from creating the social cohesion that we needed to defeat the disease and that we finally have under President Biden. Here's a poll that Donald Trump and his party should consult. The vast majority of the American people reject fascist Vladimir Putin's war of imperial aggression against the democratic nation of Ukraine. The vast majority of Americans reject it. The vast majority of the world rejects it. But Trump, who's been trying to undermine NATO for many years now, calls his hero Vladimir Putin a genius. Mike Pompeo quickly called him savvy and professed his admiration. Fascist Trump follower Nick Fuentes called for a round of applause for Russia just a couple days before the invasion at a right-wing rally in Florida, and the crowd then began to chant, "Putin, Putin, Putin." And Marjorie Taylor Greene and Paul Gosar joined in this pro-Russian circus of extremism. So now that Joe Biden has finally turned the corner on COVID, created and forged the social consensus we need to defeat the disease, turned the corner, and brought the numbers down, now our colleagues, rather than acknowledge the great success and the breakthrough that we have under President Biden and never came close to under Trump when the disease was spinning out of control, now what do? Well, they do everything they can to distract us from the humiliating record of Donald Trump on both COVID-19 and Vladimir Putin, two plagues that he helped to circulate throughout the land and throughout the world. And I'm just shocked to see that they continue to come back here and summon up all of their counterfeit outrage against us after it was Donald Trump who spread the plague across the land, just like he continues to help to try to spread the plague of right-wing authoritarianism around the world. Will one of our Republican colleagues, one of them, denounce Donald Trump or dissociate themselves from his remarks praising Vladimir Putin and calling him a genius and cheerleading for right-wing authoritarianism on the march against the free people of Ukraine? I wish one of them would do that now. Well, hearing none, then I would like to ask a question, beginning with Ms. Forbes. And my question for you is about the American Rescue Plan's temporary expansion of the Child Independent Care Tax Credit, which will allow families to at least offset a substantial portion of their child care costs this tax filing season. The expansion allows low and middle income families to get refundable credits of up to $4,000 for families with one child and up to $8,000 for families with two or more children. And actually, let me ask Professor Stevenson first, how might the expanded Child Independent Care Tax Credit affect parents' ability to participate effectively in the labor market?
Thank you. I think that tax credit is just incredibly important to help offset the cost of going to work. The bottom line is some parents cannot afford to work. I mean, that sounds like a crazy sentence to say, I can't afford to work. But actually, you heard Ms. Forbes describe her exact predicament of not being able to afford to work. And so when we look at these kind of tax credits that are primarily meant to offset the cost of childcare so that parents can work, I think that they're incredibly important. Right now, when childcare costs more than it has in the past, that tax credit is really, I think, was essential for helping to get parents back into the labor force. And I'll just end by saying women have come back at a faster pace than men to jobs. So women want to come back to work. If we can help them, when we give them these kind of tax credits, we're going to succeed in getting them back into the labor force.
Thank you. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much, Mr. Raskin. The chair now recognizes Mr. Krista Murphy for 5 minutes.
Thank you so much, Chair Clyburn. Can the staff put up the diagram for me? Well, they may not be able to. Oh, there it is. Ms. Lucas, I have a few questions about a book that you authored in 2006 called The Politically Incorrect Guide to Women, Sex, and Feminism. You wrote that book in 2006, right?
Yep.
And as you can see from this rather provocative cover, there's some bullet points that are very interesting on this particular page. Let me just start with the bottom bullet point. It says, and you wrote this, correct? Most women want a husband and a strong family, but quote unquote independent feminists pine for a sugar daddy in Uncle Sam, correct?
Yeah, I did
And
write
then
that.
You also wrote the following, you said, why the happiest women spend more time with their families and less time at work. And then in parentheses, you said, because you can't outsource parenting. You wrote that, correct?
Yes, sir.
Now, let me just ask Ms. Forbes, Ms. Forbes, do you consider yourself somebody who is fulfilled in your job and that's why you're kind of going to work and having to get childcare at the same time?
Thank you for your question. I am a very passionate person about what I do. I love working. I love my job as an early educator, and I'm growing a business as an early education consultant. And it's very challenging for me to not have that outlet for my intelligence and my passion and creativity.
Yeah, I think, it looks like Ms. Lucas may not think you're as happy as you could be. In fact, in the first bullet point, I'll just read what you said. You said, careers can be baby deniers. Women can't postpone childbearing without serious consequences. That's your first bullet point, right, Ms. Lucas?
Yes, sir. I think there's a lack of.
You spent a career at the organization that you were at. In fact, in 2006, you were the vice president there, and today you're the president of that same organization. You spent 15 years there, which is a good, successful career there, right?
Yes, sir.
And you have at least 5 children, isn't that right?
I have 5 children. Yes, thank you.
And it looks like your career did not prevent you from raising children very successfully. Congratulations. It
Thanks.
looks like for other people, however, it's very difficult for them to potentially raise children.
No, sir, we've looked at, there's a lot of.
Having a fulfilling career. Let me ask Betsy Stevenson a question here, because Ms. Lucas has been highly, highly critical of institutionalized daycare. In fact, she considers that to be a very negative influence on children and their futures. But I'm hearing a totally different story from Betsy Stevenson based on the actual data. Ms. Stevenson, do you agree with the conclusion that institutionalized childcare that would be provided by quote unquote Uncle Sam, according to Ms. Lucas, would somehow would have a negative impact on children?
I think that the American public school system, K-12, has been an enormous success. And in fact, go back to the idea of what have we learned from the greatest generation. Americans built high schools when no other country in the world was, and it's actually what fueled our growth in the last century. I think what will fuel our growth in this century is actually expanding education down to our youngest citizens. So, and the evidence suggests that center-based care, that's curriculum-based, that is developmentally appropriate, does generate massive benefits for children because the science tells us when children develop.
Let me interrupt for 1 second. Ms. Lucas also said on page 197 of her book, families who want to keep a parent home with their children shouldn't have to pay taxes to support daycare for other people's children. How do you respond to that, Ms. Stevenson?
Well, first of all, those children are allowing parents to go to work, and the parents are paying taxes on that income that they're earning while their kids are in childcare. That childcare is also allowing those kids to earn more as adults, and they're going to pay taxes on that. Actually, the bigger problem is that when people stay home and provide care for their children, they're providing a valuable service for their family, and unlike traded services, they're not actually taxed on those goods that they're creating and the value that they're providing for their family.
Thank you so much. I yield back.
Thank you, gentlemen, for yielding back. I think that no other Republicans are going to return to the hearing. In the interest of time, the chair is going to yield for 2.5 minutes for any response that Ms. Lucas would like to make.
Yeah, thank you so much, Chairman. I really appreciate that, because I do want to correct the record on a little bit of how my thoughts were characterized, particularly about working parents and some of the data that was in the book that I wrote 15 years ago now, and that I was trying to correct, because I do think that when you look at I particularly went through and looked at some of the women's studies programs and some of the information that was being given, and found that there was a tremendous lack of coverage of things like infertility. And there's been a lot of information showing that young women tend not to recognize the amount of difficulty that women often have in trying to get pregnant after the age of 35, and I think that's something that women should be aware of. 1 in 3 women suffer from infertility, and obviously not everyone wants a child, and you can't have a tremendously fulfilling life without a child, but I hate to think of the heartbreak that many people experience when they aren't aware of the problems associated with infertility. And similarly, I think there has been a lot of women, and this looking at polling information, as we talked, polling information can be very helpful, and that there's a lot of women who do end up feeling a sense of regret when they haven't had time to spend at home with their children. I obviously think that daycare is incredibly important. I've used daycare at different times during my 16 or 17 years as a mom now, but I do think that parents should have a recognition that sometimes it's better to stay at home, and there is value in staying at home. And just the final point I'll make is I do think we should be cautious. You can find studies that show that high-quality childcare is associated with positive life outcomes. But there's also a lot that show the opposite. I'm sure all the scholars here have seen this very recent program finding from the Tennessee. This was meant to be a high-quality child care program, preschool program, and they found negative effects going in 3rd grade and again in 6th grade, both in terms of education and in terms of discipline and mental health. So we need to be cautious. This doesn't mean that it can't work, but it does mean that we don't know everything, and we should have a little humility in knowing that we don't know exactly what a quality daycare is or what a quality provider is, which is why we need to empower parents and not just government. Thank you.
I thank the witness for her statement. I think the ranking member has informed me that he will not be returning to this hearing, so the chair recognizes himself for a closing statement. I want to thank all of the witnesses for testifying before the Select Subcommittee today. We appreciate your insight, your expertise, and most importantly, your dedication to the well-being of children and families. In light of your testimony, I want to make it clear to America's families and caregivers of young children that their sacrifice, determination, and hard work, especially in the face of the challenges presented by the pandemic, are recognized and valued. We must continue to dedicate the necessary resources to ensure that child care is affordable, caregivers are well paid, and that any parent who wants to rejoin the labor force is able to access the child care necessary to do so. I applaud the Biden-Harris administration for its leadership in responding to these challenges and prioritizing children, families, and caregivers. They recognize, as I do, that overcoming the challenges discussed today is essential to both our immediate economic recovery from the pandemic and this country's long-term prosperity. With that and without objection, all members will have 5 legislative days within which to submit additional written questions for the witnesses to the chair, which will be forwarded to the witnesses for their response. This hearing is adjourned.